I see the numbers climbing and everyone's jumping on the call. Please, those who've joined already, please put in the chat where you're from. Oh, I already have our first response, and that's our friend of the Good Governance Academy, Ilse Morgan from South Africa. And I have to say, Ilse is a regular attendee and a friend and a colleague in Pretoria in South Africa. And Siham Boda, do I present that correct, Siham? Lovely to have you here, and I'll introduce you and George shortly as our attendees, so that's fantastic. Cape Town, Ethiopia, oh, even Damien from Prague, the most beautiful city in Europe, in the Czech Republic, Vintic, Namibia, Desiree, welcome. We're giving it a few minutes for our attendees to all get on board. Okay, George, lovely. Oh, there, Bada Prasad, I think you also from Sydney. I recognize your name as a regular. Lovely to see everyone again. Johannesburg, Ghana, also Pretoria, a sunny Cape Town. I'm glad to hear that it's sunny today in Cape Town, the beautiful Cape Town. Malaysia, Cape Town, Johannesburg as well. So tell us where you're from as we allow all our attendees to join the chat and get on board. Okay. Also Pretoria, Taka, Philip from Johannesburg. Okay, Alfred, Pretoria. Fantastic. Okay. All right, we're going to give it another minute or two to just make sure that we get everyone on board. Alexia from Zimbabwe, Irvin Nels from Namibia, Windhoek, Luxembourg. Fantastic. We indeed have a very interesting topic for discussion and webinar today, which really makes sense that we have so many attendees today from all over the world. I love the pragmatic approach, so really excited to get this started. Sunil also from Cape Town. Okay, so I think it's 2 past and all right. So let's get this started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindy Greber from the Research Forum of the Good Governance Academy. I'm so excited to be here and present the Research Forum. That's one of our initiatives within the Good Governance Academy. And we invite our attendees to have a look at our specific research and discussions page on the Good Governance Academy website, and also find previous events and initiatives from our side under past events or previous events on the website. The Research Forum is part of the bigger Good Governance Academy, where we encourage collaboration between researchers, not only academics, but in practice from all over on various topics that relates to good governance. And we really encourage or invite all of you to come and have a look at our website and reach out to us should you want to collaborate in any of these initiatives or contribute from your own research. And then also, yes, it's a wonderful platform where we share also the research that's being done. As you all know, a connection between research and practice is always very important between academia and practitioners. So we really encourage participation. But enough from that or on that, just to introduce myself again. So I'm Lindy Greber, and I'm very excited today to host our 2 presenters, Siham Boda and George Nichols, to present for us on managing conflicts of interest. And before I hand over to them, I just on an admin level, everyone please feel free to write any questions, comments, or information from your side in the chat, or also in the Q&A functionality. Remember that this event or webinar will be recorded, and you can have a look at it on our YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe to the GGA YouTube channel, and then also more information will be available under past events or in general on our website, the Good Governance Academy website. Anyway, so getting back to our presenters, Siham Boda is an advocate of the High Court in South Africa and a very experienced fraud investigator. And together with her, we have George Nichols, who will also be presenting today. He's also an experienced fraud investigator and the CTO of Corporate Insights. Now, from my perspective as an auditor, it's really exciting and interesting to hear more about conflicts of interest, and not technically or strictly the conflicts of interest I know so well in terms of performing a statutory financial audit. This is more practical in the everyday workplace, and it's about managing those conflicts of interest that we might not even realize exist. But anyways, over rather to the experts on that, and I'd love to welcome Siham to please share your slides and introduce yourself and share more knowledge about that with all of us. Thank you.
Hi, Lindy. Good afternoon to everyone attending online. I'm very pleased to have been invited together with George to present today, and we're really looking forward to having this conversation with you. As Lindy said, please pop your questions into the Q&A as we've allocated some time at the end to engage with you and share all our knowledge and collective wisdom on that. I just want to do a tech check. Are you seeing everything clear on your side, Lindy?
Yes, all good from our side. Lindy, you're on mute. Wait, we're seeing both your presentation and your notes.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Carolyn.
That's not supposed to be. Let me just try that again. Let me do that once more.
Of course, that's part of any webinar. And what I also see in your notes to the presentation or to the webinar is indeed how we all develop, or not all of us, but we are so enabled now these days with technology, AI, etc., and working from home to start those side hustles, that indeed technology is part of the game of and one of the risks to conflict of interest. So, okay, but great. We can see your slides properly now. So thank you so much. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lindy. So as I mentioned, I just want to see whether it's still popping through with my notes on, or are you just seeing?
Just yours, thanks.
Okay, great stuff. You don't have to see all my squiggles, which is a bit odd. So as you write, conflicts of interest aren't just of concern to CEOs and board members. So we haven't pitched the presentation to that, because really they can arise in everyday decisions that we all make. Whether you're leading a team or managing a project, understanding how to handle these conflicts is key to maintaining trust and transparency in the corporate world and also in the public sector. Today, we'll explore how the principles of good governance, accountability, fairness, and integrity help us navigate these challenges and ensure better decision-making in our organizations. So let's get started. This is what we have on our agenda for you today. We'll be looking at the rise of side hustles and their impact on workplace integrity. We're going to be discussing some common conflicts of interest that George and I see in our practice quite a lot, some red flags for companies to watch out for, and some preventative measures that can be taken to manage them. One of the really key parts of our presentation today is a case study that George and I have developed with the access to the data we have, and some trends that we've seen in of interest to the audience. One thing we can take comfort from is that governance concerns are not new. They are ordinary. They've been going around for as long as there's been record keeping. And there are some really startling examples. Here's one from Egypt where some rulers were concerned about corruption in the judiciary. There were a few examples, well, several examples in Rome, but one that seems very pertinent for our circumstances is that senators were prevented from engaging in certain business ventures to prevent conflicts between their public duties and the personal financial interests. So that seems really familiar, and we think we covering new terrain in our modern era in South Africa, but it's really a case of been there, done that. There were also great examples between the British and the Dutch East India companies. And in the good US of A, George Washington himself had personal financial interests in land speculation, which created potential conflicts of interest during his political career. And then, of course, we all look to the great industrialists like Carnegie and Rockefeller, but that era was also rife with corruption, where public officials often had conflicting interests between serving the public and promoting the business interests of these major industrialists. So, nothing new to see here, quite ordinary business in our human endeavor. And more recently, we see matters like Watergate, Enron, closer to home, state capture, FIFA, etc. So, long story short, conflicts of interest have been around for as long as people have been keeping records. The key principles, as probably everybody in our audience knows, of good governance form the foundation for responsible and effective management of organizations. These principles guide decision-making, behavior, and accountability within both the public and private sectors. By integrating these principles into governance frameworks, organizations can effectively identify, disclose, and manage conflicts of interest, ensuring that decisions are made in a manner that upholds integrity, accountability, and fairness. Without addressing conflict of interest through these principles, organizations risk losing stakeholder trust, facing legal challenges, and compromising their overall governance standards. So when you're talking about conflicts of interest, what are we talking about really? What we need to address with this concept is a conflict of interest arises where a person or entity has competing interests or loyalties that could potentially influence their ability to act impartially. It typically involves a situation where personal, financial, or professional interests conflict with the obligations to act in the best interests of a third party, such as an employer, a client, or organization. So generally you find if you're in a position where you have a dual role or responsibilities, can gain it's gone very quickly, can gain, it's just run away with me, can gain from personal can gain personally in a financial way if there's bias in decision making and where confidential information is compromised. That generally puts you in a position where you will find yourself conflicted in terms of what your primary role and duty is towards that organization. And I hope my mouse doesn't run away with me again. So some examples of conflict of interest that we often find is where a board member has a financial interest in a company bidding for a contract, or a CEO who sits on a board of a supplier company, and they really need to be transparent about that relation. You find in a hiring or procurement process, you might find a conflict arising if an employee recommends a family member or friend without disclosing the relationship. Now, this could seem really pedestrian to tried and very experienced professionals like members in our audience. But I'll have you know that as recently as last week, in matters that we've been dealing with for very large organizations, these are the three examples that I'm mentioning are ones that have come up. So they come up in the ordinary course of business in the largest organizations with the most rigorous protocols. So it's something that I always find useful to reflect on and have a refresher. I did mention that we're going to look at an interesting case study just to help us imagine and think about a good illustration of how conflicts of interest arise. I'm going to hand over to George now, and he's going to take us through the data associated with this conflict of interest.
Thank you, Sihan. So if we can move forward. So this data here is South African data. The red line is the gross domestic product, and that's taken from the World Bank. So those are World Bank statistics there. And the other data comes from the CIPC, or Companies Office in South Africa. And we took a sample of 20,000 businesses that have been formed since 1892, and we plotted their formation and the active directories of, or directorships of living persons. And what we can see is that during the 2010 decade and thereafter, there's been a material spike in the number of employees that have registered businesses. And this spike is closely associated with the decline of GDP in the country. And that sort of indicates that people are looking for financial stability and a financial future. And what they're seeing is entrepreneurial activities is a popular option. And so the summary of this little bit of data research is, as the GDP declines, 34% of all businesses registered since 1892 with active directorships of employees were registered since 2020. If we take the period of COVID in a bit more detail, what we see here is a number of lines. The green line is the COVID year of 2020, the first lockdown period of COVID-19. And their subsequent lines are the years post-2020, being 2021, 2022, 23 and 24, and these are calendar years. And so what we can see is that the sharp dip on the green line in April 2020 coincided with the relaxation of the first lockdown, which was the harshest lockdown both in South Africa and generally around the world. You can see a dramatic and sharp uptake in new companies being registered from that first lockdown. And those levels of activity have not reached the same values in the following 4 years. So post-COVID, there was a dramatic move and a rather significant move to registering new businesses. And a quarter of those businesses were registered in the period of the next 3 years. So a significant event following the first lockdown. So what does that mean? With the move to hybrid working and working from home, these business interests play a part. And so what we did in our case study is we sampled 10,000 employees and 20,000 business interests of employees. You've seen the slides on South African businesses formed since 1892 and 2024. And we also took a sample and assessed just over 250,000 declaration of interests, which were returned by employees that had details on business activities, additional income or side gig income or side hustle income, connections to suppliers, and connections to suppliers for family members. And what we're going to talk through now is the results of these 250,000 declarations that we analysed that were all declared since the 2020 COVID period. So what we found when we analysed these were only 5% of all declarations were correctly made. So from over 250,000, a small number of employees correctly declared their business interest and conflicts of interest. So that tells us that either one of two things: people are not declaring them willingly, and that's a large number, 95%. Or secondly, there's some other factors that lead into this under declaration or incorrect declaration percentage. So what we found by doing analysis, by checking the declaration of interest versus the data, we found that within 4 months of somebody submitting a declaration of interest, almost 41%, you can say almost up to a half of all the data on those forms were inaccurate or invalid. And that's for a range of reasons. For example, employees might have purchased a new house, they might have formed a new company, they might have got married, they might have got divorced, they might have purchased a new car, they might have lost their job, whatever the case is. But the average cycle time for a declaration of interest process from the day a company says we are going to declare conflicts of interest and to the point where they're collected and the analysis begins is between 4 and 6 months. And that's for a medium-sized organization of, say, 5 to 10,000 employees. And so by the time that information's in, 41% of that information is no longer valid. So the risk there is that people are making decisions on inaccurate and invalid data. And I think the reason for that is the time and cost to implement these sort of manual processes. Elsewhere on the analysis, just over 7% of employees or their family members had some link to a supplier and a supplier to the company which employed them. Almost 8% had some undeclared form of conflict of interest, whether that's a side hustle, a consulting work, gifts, or other business interests. And interestingly, the most prominent or the most the sort of number of years service with the most conflicts weren't the new joiners, is people between 6 and 8 years of service. So people who've worked for an organization for a number of years, more than 5 years, were the areas where there are the most conflicts of interest. So when we did our research and we've gone back to a lot of the companies we worked with and we've asked them the information, there's certain assumptions that people make. And the one assumption is that only the executives should declare or senior managers should declare. Yet we find conflicts of interest throughout the organization from the very highest levels to the lowest levels. And therefore, if you're not collecting information on the whole organization, you're going to miss some risk. The second thing is a lot of people assumed it was new joiners, but as our facts show, that new joiners are not the most represented group for conflicts, although it does exist. It's the people who've been with the organization for a period of time and understand the culture of the organization. And those are the areas which we found most interesting from our study. Next slide, please. If we look at the increased business activity that we recorded from conflicts of interest, of all the individuals surveyed, and we surveyed 10,000 individuals, at least 1/3 had active business interests. So 30% of any organization has an active business interest. Almost 1/3 of employees had additional income from a source which wasn't their salary. So that could be a side hustle, renting out property, investment income, or whatever the case is. But so 1/3 have some form of commercial activity. And when you look at the number of business interests registered to employees, the average was at least almost 2 business interests per employee. But obviously average is meaningless without the context of the maximum was 46 employees to 46 businesses registered to 1 employee. Well, obviously a number of employees had 0. But the business interests are quite extensive, and they're not just limited to moms and pop shops. Some of them actually run quite sophisticated organizations outside of their employment. Common business interests, that's where two or more employees have a business interest together, accounted for 10% of all employee interests. And you find that often that if there's siblings or close friends or people who've got a common bond, we found that they form these business interests together. And they may not always be competing with the organization. They could have external focus, but in a large number of cases, the common business interests, or in fact, the employee business interests, seem to have a strong correlation for the area of the business they worked in. So for retailers, we looked at people who worked in the mobile phone department, we found had a large proportion of side gigs with mobile phones. People who work for the wine and spirits department had a side gig with wine and spirits, and so on. Throughout any organization we looked at, that the common theme was the external conflicting business interests would be often related to an area in which they were employed. Next slide, please. So with the new ways of working, the shift to remote work provides employees with greater flexibility, but with that comes a decrease in control, or a relaxation of control, where it's not easy to see somebody sitting with two laptops or two computers, one for their business employment work and one for their side gigs. So from our study, there is a growing trend of employees running side businesses and engaging in freelance work. And for one of our customers, we were able to track that one employee had 3 full-time jobs, one with the company that employed them, who was our customer, and 2 full-time jobs with other businesses. Equally, another one of our customers, we were able to use our systems and indicators to identify people who were in financial distress, and then that had a positive correlation with the amount of overtime that the business was paying, and that had a positive correlation with the number of side or active business interests that people have. And one of our customers was able to identify that the largest recipients of overtime were people who were running a side gig during working hours and using overtime to catch up on their employment.
It's not always so it's not black and white with people having side gigs, because there are enormous benefits that an organization could benefit from if some of the employees do have other side gigs, because they develop other skills and they learn other things. It can assist employees with work-life balance, where people need to pick up their children from school or go to an activity and work later. And it can also manage operational costs. So it's very much, how do you engage with these side hustles rather than pretend they don't happen, and to really encourage transparency and accountability. Have people understand what the impact having these side hustles could have on the business, and also where it actually conflicts with the business. For example, one of our staff members has a craft business, and she makes candles and all sorts of crafts on the side, and it has nothing to do with our core business. Be very happy to encourage her to do that in her spare time. Sometimes we might use it as a corporate gift, etc. But really, there is no conflict of interest with our organization. So one needs to take a very common sense approach and really look at whether it's going to be a risk to your organization and be harmful in terms of your reputation. And this is where the real detail and understanding what that means becomes imperative for your business. Where does it become a risk for employers? When you start using company resources, where you have employees double dipping, where they cannot make a clear decision in the best interests of the organization because they've got their own financial, interests that they're thinking about their own personal gain, and of course where you have a concern about an increased governance risk. So let's look at those for a second. So where conflicts of interest really becomes important for governance perspectives is you've got a relaxation of control. With hybrid working, there is an element of invisibility. There's a disconnect from workplace culture, and this sometimes can have quite negative consequences. Our youngsters coming in, Generation Zs, a lot of them feel not connected to the workplace because they started their working lives in COVID. They didn't build camaraderie with fellow colleagues, and they don't really feel disconnected. They don't feel connected to the workplace. So for them to be pursuing other side hustles and that sort of thing is very easy when there isn't a connection to the business. And then, of course, there's the misuse of company resources, be that computers or IP, access to confidential information, potential access to customer lists and data, etc. So what are the types of governance risks we're talking about? I did mention one of the key areas of concern is decision-making that becomes impaired because the conflict of interest really doesn't allow you to make that impartial decision which is in the best interest of the organization. And this often leads to compromised governance practices, which ultimately harm the organization's integrity and efficiency. Next one is reputational risk. So this is where conflicts of interest are undisclosed, poorly managed, and they damage the organization's credibility and public trust. And this can have very long-lasting negative effects. And then lastly, we're looking at legal and financial risk. Breaches here or failures in governance due to unmanaged conflicts of interest can expose the organization to legal liabilities, sanctions, and financial losses. Sometimes the consequences can be far-reaching and quite grave. One only needs to reference governance codes such as King 4 in South Africa, international standards, and also a slew of new legislation in South Africa, such as Directive 8, Section 34A of PRECA, and the Public Procurement Act, all which have been enacted to help with grey listing and managing conflicts of interest and corruption. So how do you, as an organization, look out for behavior that might be considered a conflict? There's a couple of things that we found that frequently occur. George has already alluded to some of it. And the one is frequent absences or unexplained time off. So what's happened with our one organization is staff take time off and then they work and claim overtime because that aligns with their personal business activities. They need to make a meeting and it conflicts with your time as an employer, and they'll just take the time off and either work later or not work at all. Unfortunately, you often also see declining productivity or missed deadlines, and this often flags because one knows that it's not a capacity issue. We know that a person is able and they have delivered well in the past, and all of a sudden now they're not delivering well, they're not delivering on time, their work is not of the standard or the quality that we're used to seeing, and that should raise a slight alarm bell there. It could be for other reasons as well, but if one looks at a variety of reasons like time off, work not being good, the is being declared in their declarations of interest, and you take all that information in a measured, rational way, one could be facing an employee who has a side hustle that duties as an employer. And then also looking at how they might misuse company resources. They might have an unusual access to proprietary data, They might be excessively printing information, using the computers and all your hardware for their other job. And then I also did allude to, maybe abnormal client interactions, use of your database, and that sort of thing. So that all of that compromises the integrity of your organization. And then, of course, having employees who have personal ties to external businesses. George gave us a few examples on that, so I'll just leave that for now. So the big question is, how does one manage these conflicts of interest? It does feel a little overwhelming sometimes. And I would say always just start at the beginning. One needs to identify and disclose. It's very important to have clear, robust, consistent systems in place. It is fairly regular for us to work with organizations who have either inconsistent systems in place, they might not do it regularly, the way that one declares might not be consistent either. So we often find huge policy gaps between maybe what the organization says they're doing and what actually happens in practice. So one often needs to find an easier way, make it easy for organizations to be able to adhere and comply. We do know that there's a lot of compliance requirements in organizations right now. How do we make it easy for them to do it consistently? Because having the inconsistent content in terms of data, frequency, quality, really is a bit of a headache for any compliance officer. And then how do you mitigate things? What do you do if you are in a conflicted situation? Do you have policies in place where the individual concerned can recuse themselves? How do you implement these declarations of interest? And how do you have an audit, like Lindy was saying in her world? How do you have that third-party oversight so that you can ensure it's fair, transparent, and accountable? Just linking back to those initial governance principles that we spoke about earlier. And then finally, are people trained? Sometimes we've spoken to individuals and really out of the goodness of their heart, they thought they were answering something honestly. They really didn't understand the question properly. Perhaps it wasn't posed in the best way and there was some ambiguity in it. How do we ensure that the individuals who implement this are properly trained and have the awareness of what you're trying to achieve in the organization? So some of the shortcomings I've alluded to in my previous slide that we encounter quite a lot with our clients is that a lot of these risk mitigation strategies often only provide a small view of risk. It's usually an audit sample that's taken throughout the organization where professionals feel it would be relevant, but really it's where your instinct tells you, okay, let's have a look at this. Let's have a look at procurement. Let's have a look at IT. And from George and our organization, we can tell you that everybody's only right 50% of the time, which is not fantastic odds, really. It's greater if you have the luxury of being able to look at the whole organization in one riskscape, so to speak, then it's really much more effective. And the other shortcoming that we find is because, unfortunately, a lot of these efforts are manual. They don't use the power that data analytics brings with them. They're not embracing automation and AI. It does leave them on the back foot slightly. So I've told you some doom and gloom, but we are solution orientated at Corporate Insights, and maybe I'll just hand over to George to share with you some solutions that might help you in your organization in terms of how you manage your conflicts of interest more effectively and productively.
Okay, next slide, please, yeah. So the best practices obviously are listed here, but the key one is to make this a tool which is a positive tool for managing the risk of conflicts of interest is to incorporate technology. Thank you, Siam. Next slide, please. So the first thing is to look at continuous assessment. So one of the points we identified from our survey was that the time it takes to complete a conflict of interest process, and these are usually run annually. But with the data available using cloud computing and the data that's available commercially, you can use always-on reporting. So the idea is to, our suggestion is to move away from once per year to do continual assessment and work on exceptions rather than collecting the whole and triaging the whole. The next thing is to use smart logic, AI, or data analytics for monitoring. So that enables you to track these things in real time. And that's a move away from paper-based or manual methods into exception-driven reporting using cloud-based technologies. And then enhancing your fraud detection tools. So a lot of the preemptive information from declaration of interest can feed into detect fraudulent activities. Thank you, Sian. Next slide. So encouraging a culture of transparency is helpful, and what we've seen using the type of technologies we've worked with is that when organizations are addressing all the principles we've put out in this presentation, but using always-on technology to manage exception-driven reporting, the levels of compliance dramatically increase over a period of a year. And that goes hand in hand in a reduction of the cost of compliance. And those are the two key takeaways here, is that the technology costs are really affordable these days, and anything that eats into the cost of compliance is a welcome development. Thank you, Siam. Over to you.
Thanks, George. Sorry, there seems to be a slight lag with us. So I think just in conclusion, we feel that conflicts of interest and all these compliance mechanisms shouldn't feel overwhelming to employers in large organizations. If you have the correct tools to support you, you can easily, there we go, you can easily adhere to everything that's required. So firstly, know your oaths. Understand what a conflict of interest means for your company. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Make sure you have your basics in place, that you've got your policies in order, that they're updated regularly, and that they're implemented correctly by your staff who are well trained. And then see what supportive mechanisms are out there that can support your staff and really encourage transparency and accountability in your organization so that it becomes quite normalized. It doesn't feel like this onerous venture that you need to adhere to. So I think we've left enough time for questions. I saw quite a few of them coming up, and we're happy to take any of them.
Well, thank you, Siam. Really interesting. And yes, indeed, we invite our audience to now post any questions or comments or observations in the Q&A. We already have one, but I wanted to ask the first question, if you would. So you've referred to, combined assurance, etc., etc. So there's a lot of ways to assure or detect even the risk of conflict of interest. And you've touched on the risks, for example, reputational, etc., and then also highlighted for us the red flags. Say, for example, someone's productivity that declines. But I'm thinking perhaps like an auditor, but there are internal controls, systems of controls and mechanisms to manage, for example, poor performance management systems, etc. So what is there really, is the risk of conflict of interest really that big? Is it significant or even financially speaking material? What is the risk to companies, in your opinion? Is it significant? Should organizations take this more seriously?
Absolutely. So we can almost break it up into various components in terms of what you're dealing with. One of our clients, for example, had IT professionals who was developing software for them, and then developing the software they developed, they then made it commercially available for other individuals. So that has a significant impact on that organization and their uniqueness in the market, because all of a sudden it's easily gotten. So, you have this situation like that. Or if you do have a board member who indicates that I should employ someone who is a family member, there's no controls in place, and that has led to, in our experience, whistleblowing reports, because people in the organization feel like, look, we've got these policies on how you recruit people, but it doesn't really matter. There is no fairness and transparency and accountability, because the board will do whatever they want and they'll appoint whoever they want, regardless of their ability. So what that does is it really starts interfering with the trust that that staff have within the organization, and they feel a lot less loyal to it, because they're like, well, if you're not going to be adhering to the policies, why should I? So the ramifications for conflict of interest can be really quite significant. George referred to that example of overtime. That was a very tiny example where someone was simply taking time off, adhering to his business, and then claiming overtime work later. And that was a significant cost to the business. And that was just one individual. I don't know if you've got some interesting examples, George.
Yeah, so in terms of costs, rands and cents to businesses, it's simple where we were able to identify tender fronting. So looking at connection to suppliers through third parties. And this is the area where a lot of the focus has been, but it's been very difficult to join the dots in these occasions. But there is a significant amount of procurement leakage from these kind of connections. So for one organization we worked with, there was more than 34 million rands of leakage on a transaction where a facilities manager was getting a benefit or a kickback for helping appoint suppliers who would then sort of furbish this person's range of properties which they owned. And so being able to sort of have access to data where you can look at property valuations, municipal valuations, number of properties, and so forth, you're able to sort of bring these areas of risk in focus. So generally, the leakages where we see most risk is around connections to suppliers through family members or third parties.
Okay, interesting. So one can make the assumption that conflict of interest and fraud and corruption works closely together and goes hand in hand. That's interesting. Okay, so we have a question in our chat, and then I'll go to the Q&A as well from Charles. He says, how can employees ensure that they are properly compliant with company policies? Most employees declare once, but forget that when there is changes in their side hustles or business ventures, that they need to update their declaration. Between employer and employer, how do we keep each other accountable? I think, George, you also referred to combined assurance, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Or not even combined, but continuous, right?
I was just taking a while to log on then. So I think there's a two-pronged approach. One is obviously clear policies which are easy to access and understand and implement. So not every policy necessarily is always in that format. Then the declaration of interest is to really think through what those questions should be. And examples where we see the ambiguity creeps in is if I say, do you or your partner, spouse have a or? So you can see in a question like that, there's several possible answers. And, it can be confusing as to what the person's answering yes or no to from those multiple questions versus not understanding what answer to give. So the construction of the questionnaire. And the last bit is to use exception-driven reporting. It's a fact of life that, and Charles has made a good point here, that people's side hustles and business ventures change. But if you're using an exception-driven approach with always on data, you're going to pick that up and proactively reach out to the employee. So it's not necessarily a punitive thing. It's a way of managing your risk and say, Charles, I see there's been a change in your business status. Please, could you update your declaration of interest? And the last bit, obviously, whatever system you use, is making it simple for people to be able to comply.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very important, Lindy, just to reiterate and underscore, you don't want to take a punitive approach, but rather a corrective one. So that's how, the second part of Charles's question is, how does the employee and employer keep each other accountable? It's really how you create that dialogue between the twos to have a no fear of consequences thing, rather than, it will be corrective in nature rather than punitive in nature. And we find often with our clients, when they have that sort of discussion, compliance automatically by default increases, because they feel like, it's a very adult conversation that's happening, that yes, we know things change, we just want to let you know that you can update it. It's not sort of like you're going to get a bad marker next to your name or something like that.
Yeah, a deep, proper awareness. Okay, and I think next question, Richard Mugwera. Richard, I think you've touched on this, but he now asks the question: how well do organizations utilize declaration of interest forms, and do most board members really and honestly make such declarations? So again, what you said, it needs to be continuous and honest and prioritized, I would guess.
Yes, and also just quite clear and unambiguous, because as George was mentioning, sometimes you get these stacked questions and people aren't quite sure what they're answering to, what they're not answering to. And the second part of Moguera's question was, do board members really and honestly make such declarations? Well, if it's a well-run board, they have to make declarations. And it should be verified by the company secretary as well in terms of compliance, to ensure that it happens. I don't know if our international audience will be very well aware of an instance in South Africa, and this is public knowledge, publicly available, where a board member purported to have a certain qualification that wasn't verified. And it was later found out that this was not to be true. So, and I mean, that was all played out in the media. The reputational harm was really quite significant for the individual concerned and for these organizations who were very, well-known, large, established organizations, to be not vetting their directors properly, so that did have quite a significant thing. So I think the way Moguera puts a system in place is, if you do put a system in place, to ensure that you do some sort of verification, because then people will be more inclined to engage productively with the process, because they know that actually this isn't a tick box exercise and it's quite a meaningful activity of the board. Yeah,
absolutely. And then just to add to that, the point earlier made that it should not only be the board, but integrated through the organization to include all levels of employees. But then definitely training as part of the awareness is necessary, because like you and Richard mentioned, it can get quite technical to determine exactly what is a conflict of interest, what is the impact, and then also the familiarity relationships with family, husband, wife, etc. It can get quite technical. So I'm guessing proper training and communication as part of general corporate governance is quite important.
And just looking at Damien's comment, yes, he's just beautifully illustrating one of the red flags that we mentioned earlier with the architectural practice. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at time. So I'm looking at the chat. So Ophelia, from the example we talked about where the employee has a personal craft in their spare time, it could be viewed as favoritism, but it's also something you can invite in your organization. It's one of the things we feel that if you take a sensible approach and put it out to the organization and say, look, we are, going to get corporate gifts, and anyone who's interested can, make an offer, let us know about it, or we're going to go out to get some quotes, let us know. There are generally pragmatic approaches, and also it depends on how large your business is. If you're a very large organization, maybe not. We're a very small organization, so it does seem appropriate. I think taking a sort of black and white, hard and fast approach to these things generally tends to either be a tick box approach, or it does seem to be a little bit strenuous, and it doesn't always make sense. And then just looking at Philip's question here, I look at side hustles as a way of showing other skills that employees have outside of the company. Absolutely, and they can be incorporated into the organization. We've seen organizations where people are very good on social media and people have an interest in it and they think it's fun. And then they've been invited to work with the company's marketing department, and that's really for the betterment of the organization. So it's really, how does one engage with it and have the conversation? And I think a lot of the time we hide behind policies rules and laws, and we avoid having those conversations, which is not necessarily always in the best interest of the organization. Let's have the organization, let's see what works here. If it's something you think that's going to be a problem long term, maybe don't take it on. But if it's something that could enhance your business and lead to, employee satisfaction, you've got happy staff members, happy organization, then maybe it's something to consider. I don't know if you've got any last thoughts on comments made by Ophelia or Philip, George.
Yes, I'm just looking at some of the comments there, and I think the key takeaways is that it shouldn't be a conflict of interest. And the one from Charles is, how do you want to approach a situation where you respond as an individual to a tender and you're not aware the company's already doing business with a company that released that tender, especially if it's a different type of service, has nothing to do with the employer? Well, this is a difficult question, but presumably if you're full-time employed, your first responsibility is to your employer. And then outside of that is to get approval from the employer for any other business activities which may bring your role into dispute, and take it from there. So I think, that's hasn't changed in many years, but it's a practical approach to doing it.
Okay. I think we've got 1 minute for a final one. Can conflict of interest be also about a board members or managers influencing the hiring process to get their own people? I think that's a quite clear cut one, right? That's nepotism, and that is definitely an infringement on probably any organization's procurement processes. But your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. We've been dealing with one very recently, actually, and it always astounds me how often this one does come up. Most organizations worth their salt tend to have hiring practices and policies in place. And some do allow for deviation. So sometimes you have someone with a unique set of skills that the organization really needs, but it does need to be, as again, spoken about, documented. The board needs to discuss why that deviation is necessary, why it's absolutely critical for the organization to have that individual. And in all the cases we've dealt with where there have been deviations of procurement policies in terms of hiring practice, none of that documentation has been in place. So we haven't seen good board moments. Sometimes the role isn't specified. Sometimes the interview notes are sparse in terms of how an individual is assessed. So generally, all of those, practices need to be in place. Or a lot of HR policies do allow for a deviation in a hiring practice, but one does need to show that you've applied your mind, you've thought about why this particular individual does stand head and shoulders above the rest, and why their appointment is necessary. I hope that
Yeah.
answered the last question.
Absolutely does. And I think one of our final comments in our chat says it's rampant. And indeed, unfortunately, and it's something we need to be aware of and manage. Okay, I think our time is up. Any final remarks from you, Siham or George?
Just to thank you, Lindy and Caroline at the Good Governance Academy for having us. We hope we've had a valuable input into your participants' afternoon, taking an hour away from their desks. And we're happy to answer and field any questions that anyone might have. You can just pop us a message on our website.
Absolutely. So from our side, thank you so much. This is really practical and, like you've mentioned yourself as well, solutions driven. I think that's really positive and gave us a lot to think about. So thank you so much for your contribution this afternoon. To our attendees as well, thank you very much for being here. You'll note in the chat that Carolyn posted a note to tell you that we ask you to please participate and complete a short survey after this webinar, where you will also have the opportunity to post more questions or suggestions on topics that you find of interest and would like to see us discuss in future. And then, like Siham said, you're welcome to reach out to them if you have any further specific questions or topic-related discussions that you want to have with any of them. Otherwise, we'll be posting this on all our forums, and please go to our YouTube page, like and subscribe like I've told you, visit our website, etc. Thank you very much from the Research Forum as part of the Good Governance Academy to Carolyn and the board. Thank you so much. We hope this contributes to promoting good governance. And that's all then from our side. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening.